G'day children. Today we're looking at nervous coordination, and as it is not as difficult a section as genetics is, remember genetics has got many procedures to be followed and to recognize whether it's a complete dominant cross, incomplete, etc. We will now be looking at question papers, and via the question papers we'll be dealing with some theory. Let's start off with the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and spinal cord. And in this particular question, question 1, it gives you the picture of the brain. Let's go to the various labels here. And there are some naughty ways to remember these labels. You can find your own naughty ways to remember them anyway. Let's start off with label B, which is the biggest part of the brain. Remember the brain, you've got the right-hand side of the brain and the left-hand side of the brain. Now this is showing you a transverse section, a longitudinal section right down the center of the brain. What would it look like if I cut it down the center? So B shows you the biggest part of the brain, the cerebrum. And the cerebrum, you remember the functions of the cerebrum by the mnemonic Jim the Fourth, Roman numeral IV, 4. Jim meaning it controls judgment, intelligence, and memory. Those are your higher thought processes. So instead of saying judgment, intelligence, and memory, that's the way in which you remember it, you say it controls higher thought processes. So for example, if you're trying to find out the answer to this question, then which part of your brain will be engaged? Your cerebrum. Okay, that's Jim. I, it receives and interprets all your sensations. So all the impulses from your sense organs, all of those impulses will finally be transmitted. Their final destination would be the cerebrum. And then the cerebrum will interpret exactly what's happening. So which are the sense organs? It's your eyes, your ears, your nose, your tongue, and your skin. So all the impulses from the eye and the ear, those are the ones we're concerned about this year. All of those impulses with regards to sight and hearing, my darlings, will land up in the cerebrum. And then it will interpret exactly what you're hearing, exactly what you're seeing. Therefore, if part of the brain which is responsible for sight is damaged, although you've got a fully functioning eye, you will not be able to see because the final destination of the impulse and interpretation of the impulse is the cerebrum. Then you see label C. Now this is a bunch of nerve fibers which connects the right-hand side and left-hand side of the brain, called the corpus callosum. Then you got D, which is the smaller part. I always see it as a little chignon or a bun that a lady will place at the nape of her neck. This is the cerebellum. Oh, by the way, before I come down to the cerebellum, let's go back to the cerebrum. We said Jim the Fourth. We said Jim, judgment, intelligence, memory, your higher thought processes. I, it receives and interprets all of your sensations or impulses from your sense organs. And V, it controls all your voluntary actions, like I'm talking right now. It is controlled by my cerebrum, walking, cerebrum. So all voluntary actions are actions that you can control with your will. For example, walking from your classroom to another classroom, your cerebrum would be controlling that movement, the voluntary action. But there's another part of the brain which also plays a role in the controlling of movement, not so much the overall control, because that is your cerebrum, but the coordination of the movement, so it will be a smooth movement, will be done by your cerebellum. And I teach children to remember the functions of the cerebellum as BC. B standing for it controls your balance and equilibrium. And C for the coordination of voluntary movements. So whilst the cerebrum controls voluntary movements, the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movements. Is that okay so far? Easy to remember, control, short word, cerebrum, short word. Co-ordination, long word. Cerebellum, long word. So that's how you will not confuse those two terms. So we've done the cerebrum, we've done the cerebellum, we looked at the corpus callosum. Just below the corpus callosum, moving a little lower, because we don't do a part called the thalamus, but below the thalamus, which is there, is this area called the hypothalamus. And attached to the hypothalamus is a very important gland called the pituitary gland, which you came across when we were doing reproduction. Okay, because it was the FSH and the LH, my darlings, which was released from your pituitary gland. So anyway, today we're focusing on the hypothalamus. Hypo means below. So that means I am below the thalamus. Thalamus is this part of the brain. So I am below the thalamus, hypothalamus. Just a bit of science. You remember the functions of the hypothalamus by the mnemonic taste P. T-A-S-T-E, P. T, it controls temperature. A, it controls appetite. S, it controls sleep. The other T, it controls thirst. E, it controls emotions. And finally, the P, it controls blood pressure. So it controls so many of our faculties, my darling. So the hypothalamus is a very important part of the brain as well. Coming down, we've got the... Now, here students are normally confused, but you can be unconfused here in this diagram because you see two parts here. Just now, you'll realize why I'm talking about the two parts. When the brain elongates into the spinal cord, the first part of elongation, which leads to the spinal cord, is called the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata, my dear children, has many functions to perform, which you remember as I, C, C. Of course, you'll be writing down all these mnemonics, or you can make your own. I stands for it controls involuntary actions. Now, whilst voluntary, you had control over it, involuntary, you cannot control with your will. So your involuntary actions include like your heart rate. You can't tell your heart what to do. Breathing. Of course, you can tell me, but ma'am, I can hold my breath. But for how long, darling? Because once again, the medulla oblongata will kick in and make you start breathing because the primary instinct of every living organism is to protect itself. So I, it controls involuntary actions. C, it is like a halfway station. So from the spinal cord, impulses go through the medulla oblongata to the brain. And from the brain, it goes through the spinal cord, through the medulla oblongata to the spinal cord. So it conducts impulses to the spinal cord from the brain and to the brain from the spinal cord. And finally, the other C is that the crossing over of the cranial nerves takes place here. Cranial. Cranial is an adjective given to the brain because the brain lies in a bony part of the skull called the cranium, which protects it. So the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs, cross over here. So from the right-hand side of the brain, the nerves cross to the left-hand side of the body. And from the left-hand side of the brain, the nerves cross over to the right-hand side of the body. So the right-hand side of the brain controls the left-hand side of the body, and the left-hand side of the brain controls the right-hand side of the body. So if you have a stroke in your cerebrum, for example, or your cerebellum, a stroke is a death of a part of the brain. So if there's a death of the part of the brain on the right-hand side, then the left-hand side of your body would be affected. Good, my darling. So we looked at all the parts of the brain. We also mentioned that the brain is protected by the cranium. And there's yet one more mechanism of protection because the brain is so important. And those are the membranes surrounding the brain, or the meninges. The meninges. And between the meninges, you would find a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions the brain as well. So many modes of protection for the brain because it's such a delicate, important organ. With that being said, let's look at identify part A. We've done that. That'll be your medulla oblongata. C, corpus callosum. D, cerebellum. State 3 functions of part B. How did I teach you to remember it? Gym the fourth. Now you try and work out what gym stands for, what I stands for, and what V stands for. Remember, it's controlling all of those functions. Good. Now let's look at one more question on the brain before we'll be looking at another part. Okay. And so, my darling, we are looking at this particular question. Once again, let's quickly run through all these labels. A, that's your pituitary. I told you about that little gland that you already learned about when it came to reproduction. This will now be the big part of your brain, the cerebrum. B. C, that's the bunch of nerve fibers, corpus callosum. D, your cerebellum. And E, now notice it is elongating, coming right down here. It's not close over there. So over here would be like your medulla oblongata. Over here would be your spinal cord. But if you're still confused, then look at the questions. Then you'd have greater clarity about it. So here they didn't give you the instruction, but if you see 2 marks each, it will be give the letter and the name. So put the letter first and then the name. Give the letter and the name of the part which is used in memorizing a cell phone number. Memory, judgment, intelligence, memory. Who was that? B, cerebrum. Coordinating, long word, and cerebellum. So D, cerebellum. Secreting hormones. Remember I told you it was the pituitary, A, pituitary. Connecting the 2 hemispheres of part B, that is your right cerebrum to your left cerebrum. Of course, that would be your C, corpus callosum. The reflex action that occurs when stepping barefooted on a sharp object, that part that controls reflex actions is E, the spinal cord. And that's what we're going to be looking at next. That is the spinal cord. So for now, try and memorize all your mnemonics. And by memorizing the mnemonics, you will learn the functions of different parts of the brain. And then we'll look at a little bit more detailed questions on the brain a little later on. For now, thank you so much, as I will stop this particular first recording on nervous coordination.